Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us virtually today for our February Lunchtime Lecture. We'd also like to thank our sponsor, UT's Extended Campus. UT's Extended Campus offers graduate programs, professional certificates, and skill building courses to support your career goals no matter what your next step is. Texas Ex's members can get a 10 to 25% discount on non-credit professional education courses. You can learn more at the link that we'll drop into the chat now, extendedcampus.utexas.edu. Today, we are so excited to have Dr. Amanda Glazer with us to explore how data analytics is transforming the world of sports. Dr. Glazer is an assistant professor in the Department of Statistics and Data Science here at UT's College of Natural Sciences. Prior to joining UT in 2024, she earned her PhD in statistics from UC Berkeley. Her research focuses on developing causal inference and non-parametric methods and the associated software and tools to address real scientific problems. She also conducts research in sports analytics and previously worked as a baseball operations analyst for the San Francisco Giants for 4 years. Dr. Glazer, thank you so much for being here. I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Summer. So there's a great introduction to this. So today we're going to be talking about analytics and sports. So just a little bit of background on me. Summer already told you a little bit about who I am, but I'm a new assistant professor. So I just started last semester here at UT. I'm in the statistics and data sciences department, and I'm teaching a new sports analytics course this semester. So it's been really exciting getting to develop materials for this undergraduate course on sports analytics and explore a lot of these really exciting topics, some of which I'll talk about today. So right before I joined UT, I got my PhD in statistics from UC Berkeley, and I also got my bachelor's in math and statistics from Harvard. And then all throughout my PhD, I worked as a baseball operations analyst for the San Francisco Giants, and I had the honor of being the first female analyst that they ever hired there. So that experience really gave me a lot of practical sports experience that then I could take into my research, and then also this new sports analytics course to really, get an understanding for what teams care about when they're thinking about analytics. So today we'll talk about what sports analytics is, what the goals are, what types of questions it seeks to answer. I'm going to go through a brief history of sports analytics because it has a pretty interesting history that predates Moneyball, which is maybe what a lot of you are aware of as kind of this classic example of where sports analytics can be used. And then I'll go through a few examples of how sports analytics research looks today. So we'll talk about how we can quantify player performance and look for changes in player performance. We'll talk about how analytics can be used in in-game decision-making. And then we'll end by talking about a couple examples of how we can understand injury burden and predictors for injury using analytics. I'm going to start with a question for you all. So if you want to put in the chat, what do you think the goal of sports analytics is? What's the overarching aim here? Why do we do sports analytics? Why is this something we care about at all? So I'll go ahead and give you all a few seconds to put into the chat anything that you think is the goal of sports analytics. Okay, this is awesome. I'm seeing a lot of good stuff. So a lot of people talking about winning, beating specific teams. Okay, maximizing team performance, improving team performance, competitive advantage, wins. Okay, this is great. So I'm seeing like a lot of consistent things, mainly around improving player performance and winning. And so this is exactly what I would say as well, is that the goal of sports analytics is to win games and championships. Everything you guys put in the chat is great. Those are also goals. We want to enhance performance, usually to the goal of winning. We want to prevent injuries, to keep players healthy, to increase their longevity, and so we can keep winning games. And so I think this is something that's really, really special about sports analytics, is that we have this very clearly defined goal that we want to win games. We want to score more runs, more points, more touchdowns. And because of that, we have a way to tell if what we're doing is working, because it's working if we're winning more games or scoring more runs, points, etc. Okay, so second question for you all before I start kind of telling you all about the history of sports analytics is, what are some questions that we can tackle by sports analytics? So with that goal of winning, improving performance, reducing injuries, what are the questions we could look at? So go ahead and put in the chat any questions that you feel like sports analytics could answer. This is a good one. Pitch count and likelihood of injury. So we'll talk a little bit about pitching characteristics and injury later. So that's awesome. Should we trade Luka? I think no Mavericks fan would think we should. Okay, thinking about bunting, so a lot of in-game decision making. Okay, dimensions of individual performance that tie into the best, tie the best into winning games. So the on-base percentage example on Moneyball, which we'll also talk about, which is a really classic, great example. Successful strategies, whether we blame the coach for certain things, optimal lineups, who to buy and sell, how do we value players? These are all awesome. So these are all the sorts of things we can think about with sports analytics. And so really it gives us tools to figure out what are the most important things that we can measure that ties into this idea of winning. And so there's, kind of millions of questions we could ask here. We could think about performance, win probability, lineup decisions, rule changes, free agents, injury risk, who to draft. There's just tons of things that we could ask here. And just kind of some big buckets that I think about with sports analytics is we can think about quantifying and projecting player performance, same thing with team performance. And so with that, really thinking about what aspects of performance are the most important. We can also think about team and roster construction, which I know some of you mentioned, predicting particular matchup outcomes. So thinking about, maybe what particular pitches to throw to this batter, who to have pitch, when to have a particular reliever come in. So thinking about particular matchup outcomes. In-game strategy decisions. So, classic football example is whether to go for it on the fourth down. And so there's kind of loads of in-game decisions that you have to make and thinking about how can we use what we know about player and team performance to make those decisions. And then, of course, injury prevention, load management, big thing in the NBA right now. Thinking about, how can we prevent future injuries or predict them before they happen? Are there ways we can rest players appropriately to reduce injury risk? How can we measure that injury burden? Okay, so we're going to go back to the 50s for a minute to talk about kind of the early beginnings of sports analytics. I think this is really interesting. So, Moneyball was kind of that early 2000s revolution of sports analytics, but it actually predates it by quite a bit. So back in the 50s, a lot of people that were working as statisticians for the military, kind of as a side hobby, were doing sports analytics. And so there's numerous papers that came out in the 50s from these people that were employed by the military, but were doing all these really advanced statistical analyses on the side. And so this is kind of the earliest examples we have of really great advanced methods in sports analytics. So here's one of the earlier ones from 1954. This nice little quote here that I think is kind of funny. The resemblance of football to ground combat is well known. Baseball is analogous to a battle between two naval task forces, and basketball can be considered as a simulation of aerial warfare. And so this was in a paper that was looking at different types of running plays in football, and then the probability of you gaining a certain amount of yards based on that play and trying to optimize specific run plays. And so this was from 1954. And then a few years later, another example. So if you've ever heard of platooning in baseball, it's this idea that hitters tend to hit better against opposite-handed pitchers. So if you're a right-handed batter, you tend to hit better against left-handed pitchers instead of right-handed pitchers. And so immediately you can think if there's difference in handedness and performance, we could optimize lineups in that way. And baseball teams definitely do this, where they think about, what hand, the pitcher is throwing with, the batter is batting with, and optimize the lineup accordingly. And so this was introduced in 1958, again, by someone that was working for the military. And as a side project was going through the data and showing for specific batter and pitcher handedness, their batting average, and showing this difference here. So you can see when it's the same handedness, you have a right-handed batter and pitcher, or left-handed batter and pitcher, their batting average of the batter is much lower than if it's an opposite handedness. And so this was all the way back in 1958, and this is something that's still used today by teams to optimize lineups. So then going beyond this, so we had these kind of early articles, and then we started to have a lot more journalists writing about sports analytics in the 70s and 80s. And so got a lot of Bobs here in one bill, but we had Bob Davids, who was writing freelance baseball articles for a number of different news outlets. So the Sporting News, Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, and he founded the Society for Baseball Research, also known as SABR, in 1971, and that's still around today. And then Bill James, he coined the term sabermetrics, which means essentially baseball analytics. And he had these baseball abstracts that came out in the 70s and 80s with all sorts of baseball statistics. And then, similarly in football, in 1988, The Hidden Game of Football, which I highly recommend. It's a really, really interesting book that gives a really great history and both football as a game and the analytics portion of it. That came out in 1988, and similarly, a Basketball's Hidden Game coming out in 1988. So we had a lot of journalists writing about sports analytics and kind of a lot more movement and development of metrics, especially as data was more and more available. Because kind of the early forms of data was a lot of just what people were reporting in the news. And so we've got kind of a scattered history of data that was even available, but especially as leagues started to standardize data collection processes, more people were able to do this analysis as well. But even though sports analytics was growing in the 70s and 80s, it wasn't necessarily integrated into the game. So there's this quote by a Tigers manager on Bill James that he said, "This guy has never played baseball. I don't think he knows very much about it." And so even though we had all these people doing all these analytics and coming up with these really interesting analyses, it was not necessarily integrated into the game. There was still this kind of idea that, okay, you didn't play the game, you don't understand it in a way that's going to be useful to us. But obviously this changed. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with Moneyball. It was a New York Times bestseller, turned into a major motion picture. And so that came out in 2003. And so really we saw this rapid growth in sports analytics being adopted by teams in the early 2000s. And then also there were kind of more outlets for academic research in the early 2000s. So the Journal for Quantitative Analysis in Sports was founded in 2005. And so this was the first academic publication that focused on sports analytics. And then we also had the MIT Sloan Sports Analytics Conference, which was founded in 2006. So we started to have more venues to present academic research, to publish academic research in sports. And so we saw a real explosion of this alongside with teams really integrating it more into their workflow and using these results. And so now, I mean, you can look on any sort of, front office for a pro sports team. I just screen grabbed a few of them, but you've got tons of analysts, software engineers, data engineers, biomechanists. It's just rampant. And so kind of across all the major sports, you're seeing this more and more, and it's really integrated into the workflow for teams. So now it's a little bit of history. So I'm going to give you several examples of the ways in which sports analytics is used today. And the first of which is quantifying player performance. So like I talked about, the earliest forms of sports analytics data, or sports data rather, was through news articles. So journalists would report stats they found interesting. So this led to kind of a weird historical record of statistics, because in certain regions you would have a lot more data than others. With football, it's really interesting because you have really detailed records of performance from, teams in like Green Bay or Rock Island, because they were smaller towns. But in a city like New York, you have a lot less detailed data because there was so much more going on in New York City. And so journalists were focused on more things, whereas for small towns, we have a really detailed record of data on football performance. But the box score is kind of this first example of sports statistics being reported. So this guy, Henry Chadwick, he was English, born in 1824, and he moved to the US in 1837. And he was a cricket reporter for the New York Times. But when he moved to the US and first saw a baseball game, he was completely amazed by it. He loved baseball. He became a baseball reporter. And he formulated this modern box score in 1859. And there's a little picture of it here. So you can see, for the different players, we've got some basic stats about, the runs, singles, putouts, etc. So different information about the game. And this was a modified cricket box score. So cricket already had kind of this idea of a box score. And because he had been a cricket reporter, he was really familiar with this. And so he modified it to baseball. And that's, pretty standard today. And you see that in a lot of articles, or you see people filling it out at different baseball games. And so, because photography and video isn't like is today, the box score was a way of showing the game. And so it was a way of telling people about what had happened and giving them that narrative. And it was kind of this early form of statistics we had on sports where we had all these counting stats. So we could count what had happened in the game. And so we moved from that to a lot more advanced statistics. And so this box score is an example of these basic counting stats. So thinking about things across sports like points, hits, touchdowns, goals. Eventually we realized, okay, context matters. We could have someone with, some amount of home runs, but if we don't know how many opportunities they had, how many times did they go up to bat, or, how many shots did they attempt in basketball, we don't have the full picture. And so when people started to realize that, then we moved from these counting stats to rate stats. So things like on-base percentage, which we'll talk about more, 3-point percentage. So really adjusting for the number of attempts, the number of opportunities the player had to better contextualize that information. So then we go from there, from saying, okay, this is great. We know their opportunities, we know what they're doing. But what about their teammates? Who are they on the court with? Who are they on the field with? Who are they playing against? How difficult is their schedule? And so this is when we started to develop statistics to adjust for their teammates and opponents. So one example of this in basketball is adjusted plus minus, which doesn't just look at the difference in the points scored while you're on the court versus scored against you, but it adjusts for the teammates that you're on the court with and the opponents, so the members of the team you're playing. And so it's adjusting for both of these factors to take that into account. And then kind of the last leap we had here was thinking about value-driven metrics. So not just looking at what happened, but how much they're worth. And so things like quarterback rating, QBR in football, WOBA in baseball, expected possession value in basketball. So these are all trying to translate what actually happened to in terms of expected points, expected runs, translating what actually happened to how valuable it is. So this is to this point of, really what we care about is winning. And to that end, we care about scoring more points, scoring more runs. So let's put a number on that. When you hit a double, how many runs is that worth to us? So putting point values, run values on things. So that was sort of the last evolution of sports statistics. So we start from a place where we have all these raw numbers, but it becomes a lot more insightful when we can think about the context, the competition, and the impact. So then we come to this question, okay, we have all these metrics that people have created, sports analytics is booming. So how do we know when a particular metric is meaningful? How do we know when it's useful to us? Classic example, really, really great at Moneyball is this he gets on base scene. I'm sure many of you have seen it. It's this really great scene where, the scouts are kind of talking about batting average and some of these older, more traditional baseball metrics. And Brad Pitt's like, no, what we care about is that he gets on base. And so this really highlights the shift in baseball analytics where traditionally we were thinking about batting average, which was the hits divided by at-bats. And the key thing here was that it was ignoring walks because the idea was, okay, well, they're not hitting the ball into play. That's not telling us anything about the skill of the batter, which, now people don't believe to be true. But that was the idea behind batting average. And with this analytics revolution, people were saying, okay, no, actually, we do care about walks. We just care about you getting on base because that's what's going to give us runs. And so analytics revealed that it was a better predictor of run production, team success. And there's this really great scene in Moneyball where he's articulating exactly that. And so we're able to look at that and really prove that using data. And so here's just a little example. So I can look at the correlation. So how well OBP on base percentage relates to batter's runs. and I can compare that to batting average. So here, this was, I think, last year's data or the last couple of years of data. I looked at a player's on base percentage and I looked at their runs, and you can see here that as on base percentage increases, so does runs. And the correlation value here is about 0.56, whereas the correlation with batting average is much lower. I think it was around 0.45. It varies a little bit depending on the year. But this is a way to really prove that, okay, on base percentage is better because it's related better to runs. It's predicting the number of runs better. And at the end of the day, going back to that initial question, what do we care about? We care about wins. And how do we get wins? By getting runs. And so really thinking about for players, we want them, a good metric is something that's relating to what we actually care about. And in this case, what we care about is runs. And so this was the way to prove that OBP was actually a better metric of player performance than batting average. And you can imagine you could do this with stats across any sports. So actually in my class this week, my students are going to look at some different quarterback metrics. So things like QBR or completion percentage, and look at how that correlates with points, with win percentage, et cetera. And you can really test different metrics and figure out what is the best predictor of those team wins. So with all these tools to measure performance, another question that comes up, and something that I've been thinking about a lot with my research lately, is how can we determine when that performance is changing? So teams are constantly monitoring player performance to detect improvement, slumps, injury risk. A lot of times performance will go down right before an injury. Is this just random noise we're seeing, so-called hot streak or cold streak, or is this a longer term improvement? Is this player at risk for injury? So we really want to, once we feel good about how we're measuring performance, look for changes. And so this is really, really difficult because a lot of these measures are quite noisy. So, here's an example looking at Steph Curry, his 3-point percentage, and this was for last season. And so what you can see is that here's his attempts in this plot, and you can see that it takes a while for the 3-point percentage to stabilize. It really it's kind of up above 45%, and then it starts to decline. And it's not really until we're at kind of over 300 or maybe even further on that we start to get a pretty stable measure of its 3-point percentage. And so we're measuring things that, there is kind of noise, there's randomness involved. And so it might take a while for that statistic to be an accurate measure of the true value for that player. And kind of in the same vein, we could look at his 3-point percentage for his last 5 games, so a rolling average here. And what you can see is that it bounces around a lot. And so this is the issue with small sample sizes, is that they can be quite noisy. They're imperfect estimates for the player's true performance or talent level. And so we kind of want to balance having enough sample to really say, okay, this is what I think the value of this metric is, and then also be able to detect changes as quickly as possible when something does change. So this is current research I've been working on. I won't go into the details of exactly how this algorithm works, but for both rate measures, so things like 3-point percentage, and continuous measures, so things like pitch velocity, I've created a couple different algorithms that will quickly detect changes in player performance. And so here's a really kind of easy case example. So this is Jordan Hicks, who's a pitcher, and he shifted from a relief role where he was pitching much fewer innings on average to a starter role where he's pitching a lot more. And so when you start pitching a lot more, your velocity, your fastball velocity tends to drop because you've got to preserve your arm over many more pitches than you were pitching before. And so this is a pretty easy case, but the algorithm was able to detect, okay, we've got this change once he shifts the following season into this relief role. And it's also able to detect much more subtle changes. And so this is kind of, just pointing out some new work where, we're trying to figure out, okay, how can we know when a performance metric has stabilized? And then how can we also know when it changes? And then just thinking into the future, this could be really useful. We'll talk a little bit about pitcher injuries. Pitcher elbow injuries is a big issue right now. So this could perhaps be used to detect, drops in velocity that are maybe correlated with an upcoming pitcher injury. Okay, so the next thing I'll talk about is in-game decision making. So I'm just going to give a quick example of this. So we have these performance metrics across sports, and we can use them to guide in-game decisions. So there's a couple of different ways to do this. So one, we could put players in situations that maximize their performance. So thinking about, for example, the platoon decisions we talked about at the beginning. So thinking about, when to put in a pitcher based on the batter handedness. So thinking about how players perform in particular situations. So thinking about that lineup construction, pitching changes, platoon decisions, whether to intentionally walk a player. So all of these things can be answered thinking about how players perform in particular situations. The other thing we can do is we can make decisions that maximize the number of points, goals, runs, wins that we expect to get from making that decision. So we'll look at an example in basketball. So this was kind of the classic example where basketball really changed and became a lot more three-point shooting than it was before. And that was all about maximizing the expected number of points. But there's a lot of decisions we can make thinking about this, such as whether to go for it on a fourth down, when to pass versus run, specific shot selection. So all of this is going back to thinking about, how players perform in particular situations, what decision is going to kind of put them in the best situation. Okay. So in basketball, so we've seen a huge change thanks to the Golden State Warriors and Steph Curry around the mid 2010s. And so you can see here, this is just a little plot of the percentage of field goal attempts that were in the paint, so closer to the basket, mid-range, so in this area right here, and then three-point shots, so beyond the three-point line. And what you can see here is that while the percentage of shots in the paint has remained about steady, we see this huge rise around here in three-point shots, and then the mid-range shots are going down. And so this was a big shift in strategy, and it was part kind of in line with analytics getting bigger in basketball. And then, the Golden State Warriors happened upon, Steph Curry, Klay Thompson, who are just amazing shooters. And so it resulted in kind of all these things coming together for this big shift in strategy. And this is, pretty huge. We're going from three-point shots only accounting for a little over 20% of all attempts to close to 40%. So it's about a 20% shift. So that's pretty massive strategy difference. And the reason that this happened was that teams started to realize, and in particular, when Steve Kerr came over to the Golden State Warriors, he really realized, if we put our players in positions where they're maximizing the expected number of points, that being the probability of them making a shot times the points if they make it, that's the best strategy here. So this is, you can go to this website. It's kind of cool. You can look for particular players, look at their expected points from different areas of the court. And what you can see for Steph Curry here is that these three-point shots maximizes expected number of points. So the idea is, even though these shots are a little bit harder to make on average, you get 3 points instead of 2 points, which is what you would get in this area. So if the difficulty is not, if the gap in difficulty isn't too great, the fact that you get more points makes up for that. And so really we're just trying to maximize this expected point. So the probability of you making the shot times the points, either 3 or 2 if you make it. And that is what started to guide this in-game decision making in basketball. So we saw this huge shift once people realized that, okay, we should start thinking about the value of these shots. How many points on average are we going to get from this? And so this totally revolutionized basketball and is, I think, a really great example of how analytics were used to really change the game in a pretty dramatic way. Okay, and then so the last example I wanted to give to you all is talking about injury burden. And so there's a lot of different questions we can ask in injury analytics. this is a really big topic kind of across sports right now. So thinking about which players are at the highest risk for injury based on workload and biomechanics, I think this is a really exciting area, especially as we get more and more biomechanics data that's available. There's more opportunity to really look at specific mechanics and player movement and how that might relate to injury risk. And then, being able to detect injuries before they happen. So either by monitoring performance, like I was showing before, flagging for pitchers when velocity decreases, and maybe that's an indication of injury. Being able to flag different changes in performance in biomechanics to detect those injuries before they happen is huge. And then also questions about, how do we get a player back to their prior performance level? How long does it take for a player to return to their prior performance level? Are there particular things we can do, particular ways they can rehab to get them back to that prior performance level quicker? And then also, how much injury burden does this put on a team? How much does a player's injury impact a team's performance? This is also something that we would be interested in measuring. So like I mentioned, in Major League Baseball, this is a huge, huge question right now because the number of pitcher IL injured list placements has really increased in the last several years. And I think it's been pretty high profile because a lot of, star pitchers have gone down with this Tommy John surgery. So we've seen a huge increase in the surgery. It's kind of not an if sort of thing anymore. It's just a when is this going to happen to a pitcher. Most pitchers that get drafted have an abnormal UCL, which is the ligament that gets injured when they have to have Tommy John surgery. And so there's this ESPN article that I put the link for here that talks about this new MLB study where they were looking at factors contributing to this rise in pitcher injuries. And one of the biggest things they found is that it's correlated with players throwing harder, so higher velocity. And so along with this rise in injuries, we've seen this huge rise in emphasis on throwing harder. And the reason players are doing that is because that's also correlated with better outcomes. And so it's kind of a hard situation when something that's going to get you injured, but it's also allowing you to perform a lot better. And then the other thing with this is that there's been a number of medical advancements that now allow pitchers to pretty quickly make a full recovery. It takes about a year, but it used to be that Tommy John surgery was a career-ending surgery that, rather a UCL injury was career-ending, that you just couldn't come back from it. But now as they've, made a lot of advances, especially in recent years, they just keep kind of making this procedure better and better. It's no longer career ending. And in fact, they can get back to their performance prior to having that surgery. So I think there's also this mentality amongst pitchers that, it's just something that's going to happen, but it's going to be okay because they're going to have surgery and come back to their prior level of performance. So there's a lot of interesting questions around this. Like we've talked about, can we figure out drops in particular metrics like biomechanics metrics or velocity that indicate that an injury is about to occur? Can we figure out what the predictors of injury are here? So this has been another research area of mine, is looking into these pitcher elbow injuries and figuring out what is the most significant predictor of injury, and if there's anything we can do to prevent that. Are there sort of strategies for resting pitchers, or are there particular pitches that maybe they shouldn't be pitching? Because there's kind of this idea that certain pitch mechanics from certain pitch types lead to a higher risk of injury. So really trying to figure out, how can we keep these pitchers healthy and avoiding the surgery that's just going up and up. So another example of some research I've done looking at injury burden is in football. So kind of the typical way to measure injury burden was just to sum the games missed by a player, regardless of position, regardless of kind of anything else, just sum the number of games missed for the team. And so we proposed this new metric called WAGL, weighted adjusted games lost. There's a formula for it, but really all you need to know is that essentially we were applying positional weights across football. So we were looking at their franchise tags to kind of derive these positional weights, because the thinking is that, an injury to your quarterback is going to matter a lot more than an injury to your kicker. And so we want to weight those injuries appropriately, tying back to thinking about, how much value is a particular player contributing? Does it matter if this player goes down? Do we have a suitable replacement? Really thinking about the value add of these players and using that to weight injuries to better describe how much injuries a team is sustaining and what their injury burden looks like. So going back to this question of, okay, we have a new metric. How do we know if it's good? What can we look at? So here we thought, okay, well, if our metric for injury burden is good, then it should be better correlated with the difference between your preseason projected performance and your end of season performance. With the thinking being that any difference in those wins or performance metrics from the end of season to what you were projected at the beginning of season is likely in large part due to injuries, because as important injuries rack up, your performance goes down because you don't have as much, player value, top player performance on the field. And so here's a correlation table from the paper, and the paper actually just got published in the Journal of Sports Analytics, so you can take a look at it there. But essentially what we found is that this metric was more correlated with that difference. DVOA is just kind of an all-encompassing performance metric for teams in football, and then the difference in projected and end of season wins. We see that our new metric is more highly correlated with it. And if we double the weight on quarterback, so double it compared to what the franchise tag weight would say it should be, it gets even better. And so what we got from this is that, it should come as no surprise that quarterback injuries matter a lot. They're pretty significant to a team. And we got these kind of idea of the relative weights of how much an injury matters to a team. And we can quantify that injury burden by team to better understand, how much value is lost due to injury. So in terms of the future of sports analytics, I think it's a really exciting time. We're getting more and more data, like I mentioned before. So the biomechanics data, the player tracking data. Here's a little graphic I just found on the internet, which is indicative of some of the data that teams and researchers are getting access to now, where each joint is tracked in space throughout time. And so with all this new data, we can get better insights, because 100 years ago we didn't have access to all these data. 100 years ago we were looking at counting stats and trying to extract what we could from that. But as we get more information, we're able to analyze it, because the data is so critical to us using these analytics methods, creating insights. So I think the biomechanics data, especially when thinking about injuries, is pretty huge. Thinking about strategy, mechanical adjustments, really huge there. Also, of course, we've got tons of machine learning, advanced AI methods. And so these are really useful, for predicting performance, for one, but also we can think about, extracting insights from video. So using something like computer vision to extract, that player tracking type information, to analyze it for particular game strategy insights as well. We could think about, simulating games more realistically. So we can think about, the impact of certain decisions on outcomes. And so also, just in general, the improved in-game decision making. So we've seen some examples of AI-assisted referee decisions to make the game more fair. In baseball, there's the automated strike zone now. Another example of that, real-time win probability models to think about the impact of particular decisions on your win probability. So there's just a number of ways that in the future, especially, we have better methods, better models, and most critically, more data. We're going to be able to do more and more in terms of keeping players healthy, putting them in the best possible situations, and winning more games. So hopefully that gives you an overview of some of the areas currently of interest in sports analytics. I'm happy to take any questions at this time or talk about any of the examples in more detail. And
Thank you so much.
Oh, awesome.
Thank you so much. One of the questions we have is, what are your sources for the raw data?
Yeah, so there's a number of different sources? It's a really interesting question. So it depends on what it is. So some stuff, like the play-by-play information. So all sports leagues employ a league statistician, and so they report all that play-by-play information, that game level data, and so that's one source. There's in a lot of stadiums there'll be cameras, and so that tracks a lot of data. You can get biomechanics, player tracking, pitch data from stuff like that. There's also some really interesting data sources that come just from fan bases being really interested in collecting data themselves. So for example, there's this interesting data set of Tommy John injuries, which I talked about, which is just collected by people, searching through articles, just any sort of kind of place where they could get information and collecting all that data. And I think sports analytics is really beautiful because it has this really wonderful kind of open source community of people trying to collect data. So you've got a lot of, efforts to just scrape websites, collect data from news articles or from watching, game film, et cetera. So it's kind of a wide range of data sources. But with that, I mean, one thing to always think about is every data source is going to have biases, errors, problems. And so thinking through, what are the sources of error in this particular data set? Because it will always come up.
So another question that's pretty timely. How did you fare on analyzing Sunday's Super Bowl before and after the game?
Well, I was rooting for the Eagles, so I was happy with the outcome, but I was a little bit surprised that it was not closer. So I think, that's an area where you have to really, step back after something like that and look at, the play calling and kind of specific things that went wrong there to lead to this outcome. And I think I actually just read this really interesting paper too about randomness too, and just game matchups and outcomes. And certain sports like baseball is closer to a coin flip, and a lot of matchups, whereas football and basketball are a little bit less so. But I think, I guess, in answer to that particular question, I think you really start to drill down into, what exactly went wrong, what was going on with the play calling, specific player performance. But, also there's always some degree of randomness in particular outcomes.
We've got one that hits a little closer to home. So how close does Sark adhere to what the analytics say when they're making calls, when he's making
calls? So that I don't know exactly how close he adheres, but I think this is something that teams are picking up on more and more and trying to really buy in on more and more. And I think too, analytics is not to say that, coaches, scouts, that people involvement is not useful. It's really to facilitate and make that a lot quicker. And so I think teams are really realizing that it can speed up those processes and really, really allow them to make decisions quicker. There are some interesting studies that coaches tend to be a little bit more conservative, especially, in kind of high leverage situations or, in situations where their job's on the line. And so there's kind of an interesting psychological dynamic to a decision making. But I think, people are starting to see more and more that this can be a really useful tool.
So do performance results substantially change for different levels of a sport? So high school, D1, college pro?
Yeah, that's a great question. So they definitely do. And there's that's another, big area of research, is thinking about how do you translate those statistics across levels. And that's something you have to think about when building projection models or when comparing performance. So if you're thinking about, for example, with high school versus college, do we draft this high school player or this college player? How do you equate their performance? You've got, they're different ages for one, they're going to develop differently, but also, the level of competition is drastically different. So a lot of times, what people will utilize is these things called league translation factors. So you can look at players, this comes up a lot in baseball because there's so many levels of the minor league, and you can look at players that transition from one level to the next, and that difference in performance compared to those that stay within that same level. you could imagine doing this in basketball between like the G League and NBA, or you could think about it, the Euro League, other leagues as well. Huge in soccer too, because there's so many different leagues. But really looking at those transitions and how those player stats change, because they're different levels of competition, and then also potentially different play styles, different roles, etc. And so this is a huge question, huge area of research, and definitely comes into play when thinking about projecting player performance, because you have to make sure to adjust for all of that. So yeah, that's a great question, and definitely something that's an active research area.
There's one that feels a little bit related to that, which is how can analytics help GMs understand a baseline for a player's value across all of the 80 professional leagues around the world, particularly with soccer?
Yeah, so it's definitely difficult, and like you have to think about it within the context of your own team. So there's kind of, you can summarize for leagues, averages, standard deviations of performance, to get a sense of what performance looks like within that league. But within soccer, you have maybe additional questions, and I guess really across sports, of how is this player going to fit into our team, with our specific play style, in this role, how are they going to fit in? And so that can be a really tough question to answer, because a lot of times, the sample size of players maybe you want to compare it to isn't all that big. And so you have to get a little bit creative of looking at comparable players that made comparable transitions, and do a pretty detailed analysis of that. So it's that's how I would recommend doing it, is if you're looking at targeting a specific player that maybe is coming from a different league, maybe their role on the team is really different, looking for similar situations, transitioning to a team more similar to your own, and looking at how that performance translates. And there'll be some variance across players, but that's a good thing about averaging across a lot of different players, is that you get rid of some of that noise. And so those are kind of those league translation factors that I was talking about, really by just looking at similar cases and kind of what happened before and after.
Here's a question I love, and maybe if you have done this, you can help us all improve our sports betting. Have you applied your insights to any proper regular sports betting?
I haven't. I'm not a big sports bettor, but I do get that question a lot. Sports betting is really hard because, of course, they set it up where the house wins. So that's kind of like a lot of gambling. So there are companies, and I've known people that build models to try to predict, set up certain bets and try to beat the line. It is very difficult to do. It is not something I focus on as much, but that's definitely an area where analytics can help, because it can at least give you a little bit more insight on what the proper decision might be. But I mean, those betting lines, I mean, they're about as good as you can get with predicting game outcomes. So very difficult, and in some cases impossible to beat. So that is not something I have ventured in myself, but that is also another really useful source of data. So that's something that people will put into matchup models or projection models, is some of that betting data. So that's another kind of source of data that can be super useful.
So bet with your heart. Got it. Got it.
Can't go wrong.
Can you take us through what a typical day is like for an analyst for the Giants, or for any professional team?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, so baseball, it's really cool because now the teams of analysts are pretty huge. Some clubs have like 50 analysts now. The Giants had, I think, well over 20. And so that's great because it really allows you to specialize. So at the Giants, we had analysts whose, this isn't what I did, but there were analysts whose whole job was to, travel with the team and communicate with the players and the coaches about kind of all this data and stats and projections we were getting, prepare them for the game. There were big kind of pre-series packets about kind of all the opposing team information. So they really communicated that information. What I did was a little bit more on the back end. So I was building those projection models, I looked a lot at injury risks towards the end of my time there, as well as international players. And so kind of building out models to project future outcomes. And so there were several of us who were working on that back end, building the models, kind of populating those data sets with all those different metrics, and then running particular analyses. We also had people that were focused specifically on the minor leagues, so trying to focus on the minor league players and kind of plans for them to develop. We had a whole team of software engineers that were building out kind of tools for our internal system. Because one thing about sports analytics is that it's only as valuable as people are actually using it, and so that's super critical. Is that the work you're doing is getting in front of people in a way that's super accessible. And so we had all these internal tools there that these software engineers were building out to make it super accessible. Lots of visuals, very easy for people to access information on any player they wanted. Also, data engineers are super important to that end because we ingest tons and tons of data. And then, there's also people looking at, biomechanics, performance scientists, kind of on that end of player performance. And so there were a lot of people kind of in different specialized roles. My day-to-day there, so it was a lot of writing code. So kind of a combination of writing code and then meeting with people. So when I was working, for example, on some of the injury modeling, I would spend my days, analyzing the data, creating models, projections, and then a lot of time sitting with the medical staff and going through results, having them, talk to me about their different hypotheses, what different things meant, kind of data collection efforts as well. So a lot of communicating with others, talking to people about results, and then, just sitting there writing code and running analyses.
So I think we have time for maybe one more question. How or are you implementing AI in your research areas? How do you all leverage that technology?
Yeah, so kind of on a lot of different levels. So, I mean, something like ChatGPT is super useful, of course, for writing code. It's very, very helpful in speeding up that process. AI, in terms of kind of thinking about the actual models, can be useful in a lot of different ways. So I have one research project where I've been looking at some different social media data, like Reddit data. And you can use something like ChatGPT or other AI-based models to kind of extract information, sentiment and engagement metrics from this data. So it can be a useful tool for stuff like that, especially for like text-based analysis. In general, AI and machine learning models are super useful for projecting performance. I mean, kind of across sports and otherwise, I use these models all the time to predict things and to analyze different aspects of the game. So I think it's a really useful tool, from everything from writing code to building the models themselves. And I think it will really speed up a lot of processes and kind of make some of hopefully the tedious things a little bit quicker.
That is definitely the hope with AI. Let's make the tedious things less tedious for the humans. Well, thank you again, Dr. Glazer, and to UT's Extended Campus for making this event happen. Just a reminder, you can register now at texasexes.org/lunchtime lectures for our next event on March 5th. We'll have Dr. Mary Rose from UT's Department of Sociology, who'll be exploring whether America's jury system is losing its power. You definitely don't want to miss it. We're looking forward to that one. Thanks again, everybody, and we look forward to seeing you at our next one.